For years, I've made an effort to simplify my approach to gardening, to minimize the time and money I spend, while still getting outstanding results. I share my experiences with you because I know how hard it can be to find the time and money to invest in a garden. And I want to break down these barriers and help as many of you grow as I can. Obviously, there are some things that we'll always have to do as gardeners, like make sure our plants get enough sun and water and that we're growing in quality soil. But there are also so many gardening tips out there that you can probably ignore without any downside at all. And by ignoring them, you free up time and money to invest in what really works. So today I thought I'd start whittling away at these recommendations by sharing 5 popular gardening tips that you can probably ignore. I know I do. The first tip you can probably ignore is using Epsom salts as a fertilizer. Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate, and they contain 2 essential plant elements, magnesium and sulfur. They're often recommended as a fertilizer and are typically applied either by dissolving them in water and spraying them as a foliar spray, or by placing them as a solid at the base of plants. The important thing to understand about Epsom salts is that they provide no value at all unless these elements are actually deficient in the soil, which is usually not the case. And when they are deficient, there are often better options. Of course, the only way to know there's a deficiency is to have your soil tested. Our soil test showed high magnesium levels and sufficient sulfur, despite the fact we've never used Epsom salts and used no store-bought fertilizers. In our case, compost, vermicompost, and mulch have been more than enough to maintain these elements after years of intensive growing. In the unlikely event that your soil test shows a magnesium deficiency, Epsom salts can be a pretty good solution, especially if your soil isn't too acidic. If it is acidic though, dolomitic lime is a better remedy because it will supply magnesium and raise your soil pH. And if your soil test shows a sulfur deficiency, elemental sulfur is a better remedy than Epsom salts. So unless a soil test shows a magnesium deficiency, applying Epsom salts is probably a waste of time and money. The second tip you can probably ignore is to use purchased mycorrhizal amendments. Mycorrhizae are beneficial associations between plant roots and mycorrhizal fungi. Long white threads of fungal hyphae attach themselves to plant roots and act as an extension of the roots, providing plants with more nutrients and water. In return, plants give the fungi carbohydrates and B vitamins. These associations result in larger, stronger, healthier plants that are more productive. Though mycorrhizae are incredibly important, you usually don't have to buy an amendment to ensure their presence in your garden because they're naturally occurring and plentiful in most soils. And even when you do buy an amendment, the mycorrhizal fungi often arrive at your doorstep dead on arrival because they don't survive transport and storage. Fortunately, there are things you can do to increase the population of indigenous mycorrhizae in your garden. First, avoid disturbing the soil as much as possible, and don't till or double dig. Second, don't use fungicides. Third, avoid excessive fertilization, especially with phosphates, which inhibit mycorrhizal associations. Fourth, use coarse mulches like wood chips to create an excellent habitat for mycorrhizal networks. Fifth, use compost, which contains beneficial bacteria that assist in mycorrhizal activity. And sixth, plant a broad diversity of plants, including perennials and annuals. If you do these things, you can increase the indigenous mycorrhizae in your garden and save money by not buying mycorrhizal amendments, which often don't work anyway. The third tip you can ignore is saving up items like eggshells, used coffee grounds, and banana peels to include in planting holes when planting tomatoes and other crops. Because these items haven't decomposed, their nutrients won't be plant available for quite some time, and as they decompose in the soil, they may even tie up nitrogen needed by your plant. A better approach is to add the eggshells, used coffee grounds, and banana peels to your compost pile and then later apply finished compost to your garden soil. The compost will have more plant-available nutrients and won't tie up nitrogen in the soil. It'll also provide a slow release of nutrients to your plants over time. The fourth tip you can ignore is using Compost Accelerator products to get your compost cooking faster. Compost accelerators typically contain a few ingredients that are supposed to jumpstart your compost, including beneficial bacteria, a nitrogen fertilizer, and some kind of sugar to act as a food source. There are at least 3 reasons why compost activators aren't needed. First, the bacteria responsible for decomposition are already everywhere, and they're all over the material in the compost pile, so there's absolutely no reason to purchase them. and there's a good chance the product won't contain any living bacteria anyway. Second, there is no need to add purchased nitrogen fertilizer to compost. If more nitrogen is needed, just add more green compost ingredients, like used coffee grounds, grass clippings, or even human urine from a healthy person. And third, everything you add to your compost pile is a food source for bacteria. So there's no need for the additional food source in the compost activator. So my advice, don't waste your money on compost activators. You should definitely ignore today's fifth tip, which is to add sand to clay soil to improve soil texture and drainage. Clay consists of very fine soil particles, and because they're so small and densely packed, there's very little room between particles for air and water to move. As a result, clay soils have poor texture and poor drainage. Some people recommend adding sand to clay soils to improve texture and drainage. The idea is that the larger sand particles would create spaces between particles that would allow water and air to flow through. However, for this to be successful, you'd have to add enough sand that the sand would become 50% of the soil volume. That's a whole lot of sand. So much so that this approach is really impractical. And unfortunately, if you use less sand than that, you'll end up with a heavy mix of clay and sand that is more akin to concrete than anything else. The best approach to improve clay soil is to add compost and coarse organic mulches to the soil surface. A thick layer of free arborist wood chips in particular can work wonders to improve the texture and drainage of clay soils. Hey, Supervisor. So those were 5 popular gardening tips that you can probably ignore. To get through 5 tips in a relatively short video, I didn't go into exhaustive detail on each, but I have included links to all of my sources in the description below. 2 online sources that I use and I highly recommend are the Garden Professor's blog Facebook page and gardenmyths.com. I plan on doing at least a couple more videos like this over the winter, in which I examine popular gardening tips that you can probably ignore. My hope is that these videos will help you save time and money and focus your resources on what really works. If there are any tips you'd like me to cover, please let me know in a comment below. And if you'd like to see more videos like this now, please see this link to the video, 10 gardening products and practices I've abandoned and why. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on a little land without spending much or working harder than you have to.